Welcome back. Just as a reminder, be sure to join the discussion on Slack with the entire Spring team at spring1.slack.com. You're at a conference. You're here to learn about the next shiny new thing. The next talk will give you some guardrails on how to embrace change in a reasonable way. This is Stay Ahead of the Curve with Trisha G.
Hello, what a pleasure to be here. Yes, I am indeed going to talk about how to stay ahead of the curve, given that you're learning lots of new stuff at a conference like this. Let me share my screen and start my slides. Let's see. The wonderful world of Zoom presenting. Great. So yes, this is Staying Ahead of the Curve with me, Trisha G. I am the Java Advocacy Lead at JetBrains. What does that mean? That means I spend a lot of time playing with new technologies. Embracing them, learning them, and applying them in the correct place. A lot of what I do is learning about new Java technologies specifically, figuring out what they're useful for and how to use them, and showing them in the hope that maybe you might use IntelliJ IDEA when you're playing with your Java technologies, like, for example, Spring. So when it comes to learning new technologies and how to apply them, I really do know what I'm talking about here because I do this quite a lot. So we're going to talk a bit about the when, where, and how should we learn new technologies, new languages, new processes, things like that. Let me give you an example of the sort of thing that we like to do. Firstly, as developers, we frequently like to update to the latest and greatest immediately right now because it's a fun thing to do. I am definitely not immune to this particular disease, shall we say. So I had an application. This is something I put together quite a long time ago, for demonstrating Java 9, reactive code using Java 9. And it's a microservices application, and it was actually using core Java, just the JDK without any frameworks or services. So because of that, I was using WebSockets to get the services to talk to each other. But I thought, after a little while, I've been talking to a bunch of people, I thought, okay, I don't want to use WebSockets anymore. I want to use RSocket. Why? Because I don't know how RSocket works, and I would like to know how it works. So I'm going to take an application I already have, and I'm going to apply this new technology to it. And so once I've done this, what will my application look like? Well, it will look exactly the same as before, but hopefully it might have slightly better performance. There were a few downsides to this particular approach of learning a new technology. One, you can't actually measure the performance gains of an application until you've implemented the new technology. So I had no way of knowing whether my hypothesis of better performance was correct until after I'd done all of the work. That's quite a lot of work to do, to go, oh, no, that didn't work. Okay, let's roll it back. And two, at the time when I was trying to apply this particular change, using RSocket in the way that I wanted to use it, it was quite a new technology, and there was documentation. This is always the case when you're trying to be bleeding edge, ahead of the curve. I found this a lot when I was working with Java 9. My Java 9 application, I was demoing that before Java 9 was released. So when you're trying to do stuff which is new and bleeding edge, cutting edge, particularly like conference type demos, the documentation is usually there from the core team. But what you don't have is you don't have experience reports, blogs, tutorials, videos, etc., from other users who are already using it, because this is a new bleeding edge technology. So when you're using an established technology, if the core documentation, for example, the Spring documentation, is excellent, if there's something that you're trying to do, which is particularly piecing together 2 or 3 different pieces of technology, you can find someone else who's done that somewhere else in a blog or tutorial. If you are using a new piece of technology that no one's really used before, you don't really find that sort of information. Which leads to another thing. I was trying to actually use a very specific niche implementation because I wanted to use the Aeron protocol. Why did I want to use the Aeron protocol? Because it's supposed to be fast, and because my old boss wrote it. By the way, these are not necessarily great criteria for picking new technologies to use, just so you know. And finally, the other thing I realized was that if I was successful with this, if I successfully created an application using a new-ish technology with a cutting-edge protocol under the covers, and it was better performance, I would now be the expert in this particular set of technologies, and people would be asking me questions about it forever. And I thought, actually, do I really want to do this in order to move my microservices application from one sort of a transport mechanism to another? Probably not. So in the end, I sensibly stepped away from it and went, I think I'll come back to that another time. What is the moral of this particular story? Well, actually, I said we're going to talk about when, where, and how should we learn new technologies, but in actual fact, we need to step further back than that. We don't really care too much about this until we have figured out, why are we learning a new technology? Why do we want to stay ahead of the curve? What is it that we're trying to achieve with this particular type of learning? We do find, particularly if you're kind of, it happens to those of us who go to conferences, as whether they're online conferences or real life conferences, some of the why is a little bit of fear of missing out. You see people talking about technologies, frameworks, approaches that you're not using, and you think, oh my goodness, I really ought to know about that. Like, I really need to upskill on this because other people are talking about it, therefore it must be important to know. That, by the way, is not really a great reason to learn anything, particularly in our environment, because technology, it moves so fast. There are so many different frameworks, so many different languages. Even if you just restrict yourself to, say, the JVM and back-end development, you've just got a huge explosion of JVM languages, frameworks, technologies, approaches, all of those different things. And then if you add on top of that other languages and technologies, it all gets extremely intimidating. So forget all of that. Release your fear. Think, in fact, of the 3 real reasons why you're going to want to learn a new technology or framework or approach. The first one, from a day job point of view, from a people are paying us point of view, is for the business. So this is kind of, in terms of our salary, probably the most important reason as to why we might want to learn something new. The second one is for the team. So pain points the team might face. What can we do to be more productive as a team? The third one is for you. This is for you as an individual. So we're going to go through all of these in the talk and look at them in more detail. So firstly, the first reason why you might want to embrace a new technology or a new approach is for the business. Why? Well, let's look at one example. Maybe the business needs to see in real time what's going on in some way, shape or form. Maybe they used to have like nightly batch reports, or maybe they used to use, I don't know, something which is a bit more delayed. But what they want now is like a real-time analysis of social media sentiment of a particular event or a particular product at a particular time. This is the sort of thing where if you weren't doing this before, you're probably going to need a new set of technologies potentially to address this particular problem, not just in terms of, well, there'll be technologies in terms of how you do real-time streaming and events and that kind of thing, but also just from a front end point of view, compared to what I was doing in the olden days in terms of like JSPs and servlets and things, having something on the UI which is going to react in real time to data being pushed from the back end, there's a lot of different things for that. So when I put together this particular demo for this thing, this slide might look quite old to people, I'm not sure, because I haven't done any front end stuff since then. But these are the sorts of technologies that I investigated at the time in order to figure out, how am I going to show this reacting in real time? In the end, I made the rather unpopular choice of going with JavaFX, but the reason is because I'm a Java advocate and I wanted to show Java stuff. So my particular business case is a little bit different to perhaps a business use case where maybe you can hire Angular programmers very easily in your locality, or maybe you already have programmers who have good experience in any number of other different types of technologies. So it's not just about choosing the latest and greatest. Concerns like, where do I resource these skills from? How do I upskill? That kind of thing are almost probably more important than how shiny and new is this? Now, given my experience in front end at the moment is not currently up to date, if this slide is full of technologies which have gone the way of the dodo and are no longer relevant, that's actually a very important part of this conversation too. For better or for worse, technologies do ebb and flow. They do gain in popularity and they do die off. That's good news, because I didn't need to learn all of these technologies in order to make a decision on which one to use going forward. And if I had learned all of these technologies to figure out the pros and cons, and then found out that 2/3 of them are defunct 5 years later, then that would be an enormous waste of my time. In fact, I decided to invest time in 2 or 3 of these particular technologies to see how they worked. And if some of the others are no longer as relevant as they were before, that's better for me because I didn't need to learn them. I didn't invest time on them, and now I never will have to. That's great. And if some of them are still going 5 years on, that's great too. I now know that these are relevant technologies that obviously a bunch of applications have been built with, that's going to stick around for a while. And now might be a good time to pick it up if I'm going to be working on a new application where I really care about what the front end looks like. So let's look at another example of business needs that might drive a technical change. Let's sort of look at the other end of the scale. This is, for example, if you have a startup where your data structure is not well known, and your schema is kind of flexible, and it might change over time. Again, this is something I've really seen in real world. Actually, I put together this slide when I worked for MongoDB, so you'll be surprised to learn that my suggestion is MongoDB. But when I was working for MongoDB, we saw a lot of people who, particularly startups, but also enterprises, where they have data schemas where maybe they have a whole bunch of data which is basically blank, because what they do is they have tables in a relational database which has every single criteria you might possibly want to capture in for a particular entity, and 75% of them are never used because as the data evolves or changes, or as you've got different shape data, it just doesn't fit that well into some of these relational types of databases. And what it can fit better into is something like a document database, like, for example, MongoDB. I'm not completely unbiased in this choice. I haven't worked for them for like 7 years, but I still use MongoDB as my document database of choice, or any database of choice, if I'm starting a new application. I don't quite know what the shape of the data is. I know it's going to evolve over time, and I don't need to sort of do my schema design so strictly upfront. So this way I can have like some entities which might be small and sparsely populated, and some entities with a bit more information which I can add as I go along. So that might be when, I know that now people are embracing NoSQL much more than they were, say, 7 years ago when I worked for MongoDB. But it's important to understand that different business drivers are going to obviously lead us to different data storage techniques. And for example, another good example is when we are storing, in this particular case, we were storing geographical information, and MongoDB is quite good for this because it has this location which can store geo information. But another type of database which might be relevant for your business problem is, for example, a graph database like Neo4j, where the relationships are almost more important than the data itself, and the relationships can tell you something about, for example, customer patterns and usages. So yes, if you're a startup doing something like cool and trendy, oh my goodness, I feel really old when I say cool and trendy. If you are a startup trying to do something, be organic, be move forward, be flexible, there are a bunch of different technologies that you might be embracing. I know a few startups here in Seville, that map was in Seville, and they're doing stuff obviously with Spring and Spring Boot, because like, who doesn't use Spring and Spring Boot on the back end these days? Obviously, apparently Docker, because everyone's been using Docker, and I am so late to the Docker train, or should I say boat. And technologies like Flutter and continuous delivery, and this whole combination of different technologies all working together to get something high quality out quickly, in a way that I haven't seen when I worked at enterprises. However, in order to get going before they got to this kind of cool space, they were using something much more straightforward, much more established, which will allow them to get out fast, get something there and working, get a bunch of customers, and prove their product. So you don't have to go for new and shiny when you're trying to figure out, what is the niche I'm going for? Is this even going to work? These established technologies have been around because they work, because you can plug things together. They're modular. You can kind of shove something up on a website and get it working very, very quickly. So you don't have to chase the new and the shiny, even if you have a new and shiny business idea. So when we are trying to try out new technologies that solve a business problem, how and where are the right places to try and do this? Well, I highly recommend doing things like spikes or prototypes. Actually, I haven't mentioned microservices here. If you are using a microservices architecture, it is possible to potentially do, I've said down here, to use a new technology on a new project or maybe a tiny service in your infrastructure. But I do recommend that if it's a technology or approach that your team hasn't used at all, that it's not necessarily something that goes straight to production. So prototyping something, doing a couple of weeks spike or even several iterations, trying to just create a proof of concept, using something in non-production code. So I've seen a lot of places that will use other JVM languages in non-production code first, particularly test code or build and deployment code. So I've seen both Groovy and Kotlin used successfully in build and deployment and in test code. And these are good places to sort of try these techniques out, see if it works. And then, once you get comfortable with it as a team, then you might want to start putting that into code that goes into production that is that delivers customer facing functionality. Another good place is a use in internal tools. So instead of inflicting it on your customers, inflict it on your internal business users. I mean, they're probably more likely to come to your desk and shout at you if something isn't going quite right. But on the other hand, you're not going to lose quite as much money as if you did something wrong that was customer facing. So internal tools are another reasonable place to experiment with stuff once you've made some of the initial steps of figuring out if it's the right sort of technology. As I mentioned, new project or new service might be a time to experiment with things. One of the things that I think is worth doing if you are going to be investing a significant amount of energy and effort in a new technology approach framework is to investigate getting expert help in. This doesn't necessarily mean hiring a team of consultants to come in and do the work for you. Sometimes it's a case of getting in sometimes the consulting is even free or very low cost, getting in an expert to come and chat to you about, what are you trying to do? Is it the right thing? Is it the right approach? You can save a lot of money by having people who know what they're talking about come and chat to you first. One of the, I'm not going to use the word nice, one of the advantages of the current coronavirus thing is that a lot of this can be offered virtually. So you don't need to be getting an expensive person to come on site and pay a lot of expenses. You can be having virtual conversations with people who already know this stuff. So you don't have to go through all the pain of learning everything straight away. Right, the second reason I think that is sensible to be considering embracing new technologies are for the team, particularly to address pain points that you have in the team. Let's look at an example. The first example, and I see this a lot, is painful releases. We've all worked in these sorts of places where you might be working in one now, and I feel for you, where as developers, we focus a lot on code complete, writing the code, completing the feature, maybe even writing the automated tests, depends a little bit on the environment that you work in. And then sometimes it waits quite a long time for release. And these releases, they sometimes take hours and hours. I once worked for a large organization that shall remain nameless, where each release took 3 hours to do. And this is to a staging environment for us to use for QA. And we had to do, when we were doing the test phase, obviously this is like a 3-month delivery cycle in the olden days before continuous delivery. I happen to know that those olden days are still real life days for a lot of people. So 3-month release cycle. And when you're in the test phase, at the end of that, we're releasing every single week into the testing environment. And so we, the developers, had to spend 3 hours deploying into staging after hours, after 6 p.m. at night, every single Wednesday for like a month. And the business didn't really care about changing anything about this, because from their point of view, there's no cost to that. It's a development cost. But from a team point of view, this is very, very painful and not something you want to be doing. And it feels like something that should not take that amount of time. The problem with things like these kinds of pain points is the more pain points you have in your team, the more difficult it is going to be to attract and retain attract and retain the types of developers who you really want to bring the energy to your team and to do cool stuff. So this is another reason to remove the pain points. So obviously there are a bunch of like tools and technologies that you can use to help with your deployments, your continuous delivery, continuous integration, automated testing, all of that kind of thing. Again, I'm going to mention Docker because apparently everyone's been using it for 100 years and I'm really late. I have to mention TeamCity because JetBrains, who I work for, has a continuous integration environment, which actually I'm going to be unbiased and say I'm pretty happy with TeamCity. It works quite nicely. But I think the thing about painful releases is not just about downloading a new tool, using a new tool, and learning a new tool. It's very much about the processes that we use. It's about the mindset we have when we're creating our code and when we're deploying our code. I do have to give my full disclosure here. When I worked at the Financial Exchange in London, my boss was Dave Farley, who wrote the continuous delivery book. So I am a bit biased towards continuous delivery is a good thing because I've seen it work in anger. But it really is key to making sure that you have consistent quality consistently across all of your environments. And a lot of that, you need a lot of automation for that, obviously. And sometimes there's a big gap between where you are and where you want to be in terms of removing the pain of some of these deployments and so forth. But obviously automated testing is a large part of that, because otherwise you don't know if the code is any good. One of the things that kind of really blew my mind when I was learning about continuous delivery is the configuration as code thing. The fact is, I've been working with a lot of different environments all over the place with like manual configuration, very niche, very boutique, if you like. And the idea of actually having the configuration as code, configuration checked in, configuration checkable across various different environments was a really important step to me in terms of understanding how you can much more easily deploy to different environments. One of the things I really like about Spring is the fact that it kind of treats the idea of having different environments and different shaped deployments. It's very much embedded in the way that Spring kind of works. So of course, you're going to have like a staging version, a production version, a test version, and it's much easier to work that way when your framework kind of embraces that and allows you to do that. So yes, another pain point for a team. What else? Another reason why you might want to pick up a new technology is testing is hard and inconsistent. We've all been there. If we are fortunate enough to work in an environment where automated testing is done, and there are still plenty of places that don't do automated testing, sometimes you'll find these automated tests and you'll be like, well, it's failing, but I don't really know why. Or this is giving me coverage, but the test isn't really telling me what the expected behavior is. Or I've written some new features. I don't really know how to write a good test for those features. I worked in an environment where it was that we had exactly all of that. We had good test coverage, but it was difficult to know from the tests what was really being tested and why it worked the way that it did. So one of the things we did is we started using Spock, which is a Groovy testing framework. So you can use Groovy for testing Java code. There's a few nice things about Spock. One, I really like the way that the method names are strings. So your method name, it allows you to be really descriptive on what you're testing. Another thing I like is that you have, in this example, it says given, expect, and where, but the one I most often use is given, when, and then, and that's embedded in the Spock framework. So you have to say, given these circumstances, when I do this, then I expect that. And it really changed the mindset of the team to work that way. We were thinking, instead of thinking, right, test find, and you put like basically every criteria you can think of for testing find into like one enormous test, we were thinking things like this: should return null when find one finds nothing. And when we're doing, what is the thing we're actually testing? What is the one thing we're testing? What do we really expect? Now, what do we need to set that up? So Spock has this really nice way of framing the test in a way that guides the test author, the developer, to writing these kind of more BDD style tests. Another thing that's nice about this framework is it's using Groovy, which in the case of what we were trying to do, we were testing stuff that goes into MongoDB. MongoDB is a document database, and it means in the Java world, it means putting a lot of stuff into maps. And that's a little bit unwieldy in the Java world, but in the Groovy world, the syntax for creating a map is quite readable. That's what this thing is here with the ID 100 and X1 and Y2. So that Groovy just gave us, in this particular case, a much more readable set of tests, and some of the flexibility that you get from MongoDB, you could embrace that flexibility in Groovy, whereas Java was a little bit more rigid for what we wanted to do there. So if you do have a problem in terms of testing, in terms of creating tests which are readable, which you know what they do, and that are running consistently across different environments, there are a bunch of different tools for that. I just plonked like my current favorites on this particular slide. So the Rocket is Spock and Groovy, but I also, I do want to mention JUnit 5 too, because I'm super torn between Spock and JUnit 5. I really like Spock. It's really expressive. It's really allows me to write almost like text, but I really like JUnit 5 too, because it's got all the best things of Java. It's got your lovely statically typed, type-safe language, IntelliJ IDEA. Obviously, I am the developer advocate for IntelliJ IDEA, so I'm going to say nice things about IntelliJ, but IntelliJ IDEA really works very well with JUnit 5. You can do all of your refactoring and you get all of the stuff that you expect from there. You can create templates in IntelliJ IDEA, which will automatically create the right shape tests for JUnit 5 and stuff like that. So I'm always torn between the lovely expressiveness of the Spock tests, but the sweet rigidity of using Java for testing. Test containers, something else I stumbled upon fairly recently, because I was trying to test a Spring Boot microservice which happened to use MongoDB in the back end, and I had to start MongoDB on my local machine and then run my tests. And I was like, there must be a better way. Then I started playing with test containers and I'm like, oh, great, I can automate all of this. And it can all be effectively documented in my test. This requires MongoDB, this doesn't require MongoDB, and so on and so forth. So test containers combined with Docker, really nice combination for creating really high quality automated tests. So if you are trying out new technologies in order to fix problems for your team, the sorts of places that you can try this out in are fairly similar to what you'll find with a business, with spikes and prototypes, using a non-production code like tests and build, internal tools. Things like skunkworks projects and hack days. I pulled up this slide and I was like, oh my goodness, I haven't heard the term skunkworks for a long time. My internal brain goes, a skunkworks project is when a developer goes off and does whatever they want and comes back and says, oh, it's done now. You've got really no choice whether to use it or not. But it's not really like that. Skunkworks projects are, right, let's kind of get together, work on something that we think is kind of valuable, and then see if it's kind of valuable or not. Hack days, similar sort of thing, I guess. So a hack day, 24 hours, 48 hours of the team not working on their production code, not working on bugs and features, trying to work on something new. We do this at JetBrains once a year. We have a 48-hour hackathon, and like the whole company can just kind of work on new projects, whether it's something that's a pain point for them or a bright idea they've had, or, as you know, like not everyone's going to have their own ideas. So you can kind of join someone else's team if they're doing something which seems kind of interesting. Some of those projects are simply a good way to learn about something that you didn't know before. Some of those projects do actually make it into business products from JetBrains' point of view. We do sometimes sell them to customers, and some of them are useful plugins or things that developers might use that might encourage developers to use our tools. So things like hack days, sometimes the business might think, well, you know, I'm not really sure about having all of our developers across the company not working on production code for 2 days. But there are business benefits to it. Sometimes it comes up with products they can sell. Sometimes it's the business benefit is upskilling the team or sharing information across the organization, where normally you might have some organizational silos. So there's a lot of value in doing something like that. That what I haven't got on here, which is on the business slide, is the idea of perhaps paying for expert knowledge. If you're trying to fix a team problem, it's still an idea, but it might be a more difficult sell if it's something that requires some sort of financial investment from the business. The third, and probably the most interesting reason to be learning new technology, is for you yourself. And there are a bunch of different reasons why you might want to use a new technology other than shiny. So you might want to have fun. You might want to, a lot of us are developers because we love playing with technologies. We love learning new things. We love to build things. It might be that you want to upskill so that you become the go-to guru in your job, whether that's for more money, more respect, more whatever, I don't really know. It might be that you want to move into a slightly different job or a different role. I don't think I can condone that in case your employer is watching right now, but I know that some people might want to find a new job. And in which case you might want to gather a few new skills to move into the new job. Those first three I sort of call the joy reasons for learning a new technology. The fourth one is the fear reason. I don't want to be left behind. And this is common across almost all developers. It's particularly common, I find, in developers who are either fairly new, fairly junior, or who've moved from perhaps a different domain, whether it's a different technology domain or a different business domain. It can be very, very overwhelming to see all of these technologies surrounding them. And it leaves you with a sense of fear of, oh my God, like if I don't learn all of these now, imagine all the new ones which are coming later, and I will just continue to drown under the technologies. Generally speaking, it's an understandable fear, absolutely. But the fact is, there's far too much to learn. There's absolutely far too much to learn, and you will never learn it all. So embrace that. Embrace the fact that you can't learn it all. There's too much to learn right now, and there's too much coming down into the future. So you might as well focus on the things which are more important to you. You might find that some of these new technologies, or a large proportion of these new technologies, you will never have to know. You're not using them in your day job. You're not going to use them in your next job. You might use them in 5 jobs' time, in which case everything will have moved on anyway. So don't panic. It's fine. We can kind of learn stuff as we need it. We don't have to learn everything right now just in case we need it. So there's a lot of choice on things that we can learn if we are trying to learn something for ourselves. And it can be very intimidating. And this, but it can be a good thing, because it's our choice. It's not being driven by the business. It's not being driven by the team. It's being driven by what we want. So we could be trying to learn something. We could pick up something, try and learn it and go, oh, well, I don't really like this. Actually, it's not really my thing. That's fine. Put it down and pick up something else. You've just learned something really valuable, that you don't want a job that requires that particular technology. So this choice can be a good thing. So see it as a positive, really. I say that because I'm the sort of person who panics when I get overloaded by a lot of different choices. Let me give you an example from my world. Yes, this is a really horrible screenshot. I learned Java at university. I learned Java 1.1 because I'm that old. And at university, we were learning AWT, and we learned how to use applets, which are now deprecated and no one should use. And while I was at university, Java 1.2 came out. And with Java 1.2 came a new UI framework called Swing. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've been learning Java for only a year. It's a new language. And now already there's like a new UI framework, and I don't know it, and I don't understand it, and I need to know it. Otherwise, I will be irrelevant by the time I graduate from university in 2 years' time. So I put aside my own time when I wasn't doing work on my university work to implement a library system using Swing as the front end. Now, my dad is the head of careers, was the head of careers at my school, and I had already implemented for him a careers library system in Turbo Pascal as part of my sixth form project. And what I did is I rewrote that whole system in Java and Swing so that I could learn how Swing worked, and then inflicted this on my dad. I did do, there was one positive for that, because I did manage to give him a more efficient sorting mechanism, because the old Turbo Pascal one used bubble sort, which no one told me at the time was a terrible idea. But anyway, I spent like a year, invested a year in rewriting something which worked perfectly well, apart from bubble sort, just so that I could learn Swing. And then I gave it to my dad, forced it on my dad, and then I graduated like a year later, and I was working in a job where we were using JSPs and servlets when no one was using applets, and no one wrote Swing UIs. Still no one wrote Swing UIs apart from IntelliJ IDEA, which is actually, I think, a Swing UI under the covers. But I think it's the only application I can think of that uses a Swing UI. I have never had to use my Swing skills in 20 years of being a professional Java developer. So I was kind of panicking about being left behind by these technologies, and there wasn't really any need to. When you get to a particular role, you will kind of pick up those technologies that you need, and you don't have to be worried about the things you're not using yet, because you're not using them yet, and maybe you never will. So if you're learning stuff for yourself, then there are lots of different approaches that you can take in order to learn things. Now, obviously, you can use blogs, tutorials, and videos. Incidentally, there are some lovely blogs, tutorials, and videos on the JetBrains IntelliJ Idea blog and the IntelliJ Idea Guide and our YouTube channel. But also there's events like this. I mean, this is a great conference, online events and streams. These things were not really a thing before last year. You'd get some online events and streams, but now all of our conferences are much easier to access than they used to be because there's a lot of online stuff. That's a really good way. All of those things are a good way to get a feel for technology, look at trends, see what people are talking about, look at use cases, and sort of figure out if something's interesting to you or not. You don't need to go into any depth on learning this stuff. You can kind of just get a sense for where things might be going. User groups, in 2021, I'm not really sure what's happening with the user group world. I don't know if there's if your local user groups are running virtual events or not. I really liked user groups when I used to go to them physically. I would get a sense, go once a month, get a sense for the sorts of technologies people are talking about. But more important than that, not only can I speak to the speaker about his or her experiences in that technology, I can also talk to the attendees and say, are you using this? What does it look like? What are the pain points? Do you like it? Do you not like it? And I can form an opinion based on other people's experiences as to whether or not it's kind of valuable. And I can sort of see, well, these people are working for these organizations. Particularly, this is when I was in London. And I'd be like, well, do I want to work for those sorts of organizations? If so, then I probably would benefit from learning this technology. If I don't want to work for them, then I'm not really going to make the effort to learn it if it's not exciting for me. So I really found user groups very helpful for that kind of get a sense of a technology, but get a sense for, is it interesting to me and is it beneficial to me? Online courses, of course, like Udemy and so forth. Books, real paper books. They're a good place to learn stuff. Let me show you a real paper book. I forgot to get a discount code for this. For example, 97 things every Java programmer should learn, co-edited by myself. That's a gratuitous plug, over and done with. But I still use, even in this day and age of Kindle and of online content, I still use physical books sometimes to learn stuff and read things, because sometimes it's just easier to sort of flick through and see quickly the diagrams or the code samples or the whatever to figure out what's the shape of this technology? How am I going to learn it? Oh, here's the example that I want, and put post-it notes in it and things. Of course, you can read them in an e-reader as well. It doesn't have to be a physical book. Pet projects. I know a bunch of people who, I'm the sort of person who likes to write about stuff, which is why I ended up being a developer advocate. But I know a lot of developer advocates who love coding things. Obviously, we all started off as developers, and some of them have like a single pet project, which is a single business problem. For example, I don't know, chat or something like that. And they re-implement it in different frameworks, different languages, different technologies. This way, the business domain, the key features of the application stay the same every single time. And they get to try how that works in different languages or different frameworks. And that's a really nice way to compare and contrast. And it's also doesn't require you to think up a new project. You just re-implement the same thing, much like I did with my careers library system. If Dad was still at school, I might actually re-implement that in some entirely new shiny technology if I wanted to. So yes, you can start your own pet project. Obviously, you can publish it on GitHub or whatever, and that adds to your portfolio. So that can also help you find like-minded people. Or you can join an open source project. So someone else has already done the code. So you don't really need to worry too much about all the setup, all the creating a brand new application. Of course, that's not that difficult these days with Spring Boot. Spring Boot is a really good way to start up a brand new application. I remember the first time I was trying to do a hack day actually back at MongoDB, and I was working with Python folks and PHP folks, and they were able to create an application really, really easily. And I was working in the Java world, and I'm like, oh my goodness, if only there was something which would allow me to bootstrap a Java application really quickly. And about a year later, someone told me about Spring Boot, and I was like, that is exactly what I need. So I can really easily create my new project. But let's say you don't want to create a new project. Let's say you want to join someone else's because you want something which is a bit meatier, or you want to be able to work with other people who know what they're doing. So you might want to join an open source project. We actually, JetBrains, we did a JetBrains Technology Day for Java last year, and we have a presentation in that about how to join an open source project. It was a really good presentation by Marit. And she gives some great advice for how to break it into open source projects, because it can be a little bit intimidating when you don't really know what you're doing. So yes, open source projects, you can find a new project at work. We, at JetBrains, we have this idea of 20% time, and the 20% time, there's lots of things you could do with it, but one of the things you can do is look at other projects inside the organization that might be nothing to do with what you're doing, and you can devote your 20% time to working on their project. Let's say, for example, you want to do a bit of machine learning. You could find someone in the organization who's doing some machine learning stuff and work with them for 20% of your time. So that's quite a nice way to do stuff on work time. You don't have to do everything on your evenings and weekends. The most extreme way to potentially learn a new technology is to get a new job. I say extreme way, but for the first 5 years of my career, that's what I did. I was like, oh yeah, servlets, that seems cool. Let's do some servlet stuff. So get a new job, and then you're sort of forced to learn a new technology. But you still have to ask yourself every time you want to learn something new, why do you want to learn this thing? What is it you're trying to get out of it? And the main reason that you should be learning something new for yourself is because you want to. It's important that you learn something that you want to, that you think you're going to enjoy, that is going to spark that creativity in you. At the moment, after the year and a half that everybody has had, I think that's I'm not going to use the term crushing depression, but I think it's quite easy for some of us to have lost our spark and to be feeling like we really don't need anything else to worry about right now. We don't want something else to burden us. But if we're talking about new technologies or new things to play with, right now, I think as developers, if we think we should be doing something in that space, we need to pick something up which is going to spark something in us, that's going to make us feel creative, make us remember why we wanted to be developers in the first place. We shouldn't be doing it because we have to. There's so much stuff we have to do all the time that it would be nice to pick something that kind of feels good to us, that sparks that creativity. But there's also a pragmatic approach to that too. If you spend 6 months learning, I don't know, a new language, then and you decide you don't like it, the last thing you want to do is you want to be then working in that new language in a new job because you don't like it. So it's a good idea to invest time in something that you at least don't hate, because otherwise you're going to be spending yet more time doing something that you don't really enjoy. So when we're looking at the approaches that we can take to learn a new technology, a new approach, a new framework, there's quite a lot of overlap between the approaches we can take to solve a business problem, the approaches we can take to solve a problem with our team. But you'll notice that the approaches that we take for ourselves don't overlap that well with the business and with the team. And this is kind of the thing I wanted to point out. So I go to a lot of conferences, I meet a lot of people, and obviously we get very excited about doing new stuff. And obviously we want to do stuff that has value. So really we kind of want to do it for the business. But if you're learning something because you want to learn Kotlin, for example, you probably don't want to be writing a brand new application and putting it into production, or rewriting your current production application in Kotlin because you want to learn it personally, because those two goals don't necessarily match. Like they don't necessarily meet the business goals. So you want to have a really careful think about what is it you want to achieve? What does the business need to achieve? The best thing you can do is find something that meets both of those needs and that align nicely. So how can we bridge this gap? There is a definite gap between learning for yourself and implementing new stuff for the business. And the way that we can bridge that gap is to create a culture of continuous learning in our environment. And so there are a few different things that we can do to kind of help bridge this gap between growing the developers and meeting those business needs. Some of the things that I've seen work well are things like protected time for learning. So I don't mean just like sitting down on lunch breaks or after work to learn stuff. I mean like a few hours here and there to come to conferences like this, or come to conferences like this virtually, or to read books, or to do some research. We do know that as developers, the bottleneck is not what we type into the computer. The bottleneck is a learning thing. It's discovery. It's about figuring out what on earth is going on. And sometimes that means learning a bit more outside of the scope of our particular code base. So having that protected time for learning is valuable. It has business value, but it's also valuable for us as developers because it contributes to our growth. Similarly, things like brown bags, lunch and learn book clubs. At this place I used to work in London, we implemented Monday lunchtime brown bags. So you would turn up with your lunch, sit in the conference room. We're a smallish team, while I was there, sort of 12 to 20 developers, depending. And sit down in the conference room, and either one of us might give like a formal kind of talk. Like if I was practicing a conference talk, I might give a practice conference talk, or someone might talk through a particularly difficult problem that they found in the code base and how they solved it. Or someone might talk about, look, I think our continuous integration server is not doing what we need. These are the problems I've identified. There's another continuous integration server which actually does something a little bit different, and I think it's going to meet the needs. Like, let's talk through what that looks like and maybe how we can approach that. So none of these are hypothetical things. These are things that really happen. So it's fairly low cost. It's for everybody. It's one lunchtime a week in order for us to learn stuff that's relevant to ourselves and to the business. User groups, again, user groups, this comes from the point of view of when we used to go into the office and when users used to meet physically. But one of the things a business can do is, if they want to encourage their developers to attend user group sessions, because you can't force people to go to events in the evenings or weekends, is reach out to your local user group and say, do you need somewhere to host your event? Because my experience working with user groups is that we were always looking for somewhere to host events. So if an office says, right, hey, come and, in the early days of the London Java community, ThoughtWorks used to host them quite a lot. So ThoughtWorks would say, come to the office, host your event there. And it was great for ThoughtWorks because they could kind of like showcase who they were, that their office is really cool, and they could potentially like suggest to the user group people, hey, maybe you want to work for us. But it would also mean that ThoughtWorks would be encouraging their consultants to go to user group events. And it's good for the user group people because there's somewhere to have the events, and you get to see all these exciting offices where you might work when we used to work in offices. So user groups, hack days, hackathons, that kind of thing, Skunkworks projects, 20% time, and conferences. So again, it's all about, if you can encourage your organization to make time for you to learn stuff on work time, things like hack days, 48 hours, once a year. There's some business value to it, and a lot of learning value to it. Similarly, 20% time. I love the idea of 20% time, but it can be a difficult sell because it's basically 1 day a week. And you have to say to the business, for 1 day a week, your developers are not doing what you want them to do. There is a lot of value to it because your developers will be doing something that might have value to the business later, or might have value to the team, because you can work on things like continuous delivery or the deployment pipeline, that kind of thing. And it's kind of fun not to have to work on like this bug all the time. But as you know, some organizations are not necessarily sold on investing this sort of time on these kinds of things. They're a bit worried that if you upskill your developers, your upskilled developers will up and leave. And I understand that, because you don't want to be investing a lot of time and energy into training up developers who are going to leave. But there's a much higher risk, which is that if you don't train your developers, if you don't give space for them to grow and learn, they will leave. They will definitely leave. So if you give your developers time to learn this stuff and learn and grow during the workday, you will more likely retain them. So what are the benefits to doing these sorts of things? You have skilled developers, you have highly skilled developers who are now ready to adopt the right tool at the right time, instead of trying to like shoehorn their pet Scala project into production. If you're allowing people time to experiment and grow, do their 20% time, do some hackathons and things like that, then they're picking up these skills in a low risk way, where they will have the skills that are relevant at the right time. More importantly for us, you have happy developers, and happy developers are more likely to stay with your organization and to contribute as fully as they can. So what can I do as an individual developer? The most important piece of advice I have for you is don't panic. It is overwhelming. It can be overwhelming. And you come to a conference like this and you'll hear all these cool things. You're like, oh my goodness, we're not using that. And I didn't know about that. And we should do that. And that's all fine. And that's great. And by all means, write it all down. But don't panic about the fact that you don't know all of these things. And don't go on rush off and rewrite one of your microservices in the new best thing, because it might not be the right thing. It might not meet the business needs. And also, more importantly, from my point of view, is that you don't want to be the one who's going to be maintaining that from now on, because you're the only one who knows that particular technology. So don't panic, take a deep breath, write down all the stuff that's interesting to you. Find out why you want to learn a new technology, a new approach, a new thing. Find out what you're trying to fix, which is probably not like, I have a solution. I would like to find a problem for the solution. Find the why. What is the why? Is it for you? Is it for the business? Is it for the team? Then you select and test the technology. Then you figure out, does it actually fix the problem? And if it doesn't, then you go back and you iterate over it again. And if it does, then you level up and you help the team level up in that particular area. I want to finish off by talking about my RSocket story that I started this off with. It does have a happy ending. So after I struggled to, let's say incorrectly, force RSocket into my microservices application for the sake of having RSocket in my microservices application, after this, I actually ended up being invited to co-present with Josh Long at Oracle Code One. And he suggested what we do is he builds a Spring Boot backend, and I use my real-time dashboard, my JavaFX dashboard, and I will get my JavaFX dashboard to talk to his Spring Boot backend. And we will do this live coding in a demo in front of an audience of a conference. What could possibly go wrong? And as part of that, he did, one of the backend services he provided was your sort of standard REST service, but he also provided a lovely RSocket implementation too, which turns out to be really simple. And I was completely blown away. And then all I had to do was write my my RSocket client, which is going to consume that, following the newly more fleshed out documentation based on the fact that this was much more mature by the time I started doing this, and help from Josh Long. Now, I appreciate that not everyone gets the opportunity to sit down and pair with Josh Long on how to do stuff in Spring Boot, and I'm extremely fortunate to have had that experience. But the important thing, apart from the fact that Josh is awesome, the important thing is that by waiting a couple of years and finding the actual right problem to solve with this particular technology, everything fell into place at just the right time. And it really wasn't the struggle that it was when I tried to force it into the hole that I was trying to force it into. So we have to remember why it is we're trying to achieve something. That way we can actually do the right thing at the right time. The three main reasons I can think of as to why you might want to learn a new technology are to solve a business problem, to solve a team pain point, or for yourself. And the reason for yourself is a nice big set of reasons. The most important thing though, is if you're learning it for you and just for you, then do it because you want to. Don't do it because you have to or because you're afraid of something. That is the end of my presentation. I have a short page on my blog, which has got a list of some of the links of some of the stuff I've talked about, some of the demos I referred to, my reactive Spring Boot tutorial, which was based off the stuff I did with Josh, and also a tutorial on Spock, because Spock is amazing and I love it very much. So by all means, I hope this page is up and running. Go to this link and you should be able to see all the information that you need. I think, yes. Let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Trisha, for helping everyone understand how and why they should apply the things they learn at this conference in a responsible way when they get back to their projects.
You're welcome. It was fun. Thanks for having me.
If anybody has questions for Trisha, check out the join the discussion link on that'll take you to Slack. From there should be a link to a Zoom session where you can have a live Q&A with Trisha right now. Up next, we're going to get going on a topic that has me personally excited when I've got my Reactor Foundation hat on. We'll be back at 12:05 Eastern to hear about using Kotlin and coroutines with Spring.